Everyone. My name is Victoria DiFrancesco Soto, and I am the Dean of the Clinton School of Public Service. And I'm so happy to be welcoming you tonight to our joint event between the Clinton Presidential Center and the Central Arkansas Library System, with a special shout out to Nate. Where's Nate? All right, Nate, why are you hiding over there? For everything you do for the community and for tonight. Thank you, Nate. It is my honor to welcome you to tonight's program featuring best-selling author Jeffrey Toobin. Jeffrey Toobin is one of the most recognized and admired legal journalists in the country, in addition to being a longtime legal analyst for CNN and ABC News and writer for The New Yorker. He has covered all of the most dramatic legal controversies of the past 3 decades on television, through best-selling books, and in magazines. Tonight, he will discuss his latest book, Homegrown, Timothy McVeigh and the Rise of Right-Wing Extremism. Homegrown provides insights into one of the darkest chapters in modern American history, the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, and how the same radical sentiments held by Timothy McVeigh continue to fuel extremism in America and encourage acts of domestic terrorism. If you haven't already, make sure you pick up your copy of Homegrown in the lobby following the conclusion of tonight's program. And with that, it is my pleasure to invite Jeffrey Toobin and our very own Jay Barth to the stage.
Good evening, Jeff. Welcome back to Arkansas.
Hi, Jay. Hello, everyone. God, it's so good to be back. I love Little Rock. I love Arkansas.
I see a number of your friends here in the first rows.
It's going to be like more presidents from Arkansas. So I don't know. I'm going to get into more political. The politicians now, they're a little different politically than President Clinton was. The governors, the senators, not exactly a lot of Democrats these days. Anyway, but I digress.
Thanks, Jeff. So Jeff, you've thought about this case for a long time. This case nearly 30 years ago of the bombing at the Murrah Federal Building, and so I guess the question is, you could have written this book at other times over those last 28 years. Why now? Why this book now?
Well, why now? As my dad used to say, to make a long story unbearable, I covered the trials of McVeigh and Nichols, which took place in 1997, 2 years after the bombing, and the trials were moved to Denver. So I knew the story pretty well. But I didn't, write a book about it at that time. But I was pretty well steeped in it, and the story was rattling around in my head for a long time. In September of 2020, as I'm sure many of you will remember, the FBI arrested a number of people who were conspiring to kidnap the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer. And I got interested in that case because I saw that the people who were arrested were all affiliated with the Michigan militia. And I knew that Terry Nichols, who was the co-defendant to McVeigh, was from Michigan and was affiliated with the Michigan militia. And I started to, wondered what the connections were. And there were not just ideological connections between the Michigan militia of the 90s and the Michigan militia of the 20s. There were even some of the same people involved. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. And then it was only a few weeks later that January 6th happened. And I saw that the ideology was very similar. And so I thought, well, maybe I should take a look at the whole big story again. And then I found that, unbeknownst to me, and I think to virtually anyone, Stephen Jones, who was McVeigh's lead lawyer, had donated every scrap of paper that involved in the defense, 635 boxes, to the Briscoe Center at the University of Texas in Austin, which was this incredible archive of all of the records of all of his conversations with his client, all of the discovery that had been turned over by the government. So that meant that all these, the FBI interviews, the 302s, were there to be examined. This incredible resource. Now, parenthetically, I think there is questionable whether Stephen Jones should have turned that stuff over, but it wasn't my problem. And I took advantage of that, and so the combination of all those things prompted me to take this new look.
And we'll talk a little bit about Stephen Jones later on. So the first half of this book is really about the radicalization of Timothy McVeigh. And at one point in the book, you describe that as an analog radicalization. What do you mean by that? And what were its key moments?
I think there are people in this room who were alive in the 1990s. I'm going to just take a guess. And some of you may remember there was a world before the internet. Amazing, right? But Timothy McVeigh was born in 1968. He came of age in the 80s. And he was radicalized in various ways, which we will discuss, and decided that he wanted to proselytize and he wanted to convince others of his views, but he didn't have a vehicle to do it. He went to gun shows. He tried to talk to other people there, but he didn't have the personality or the demeanor or to do it. And he never really had much he never really had any success recruiting others because he didn't have the internet. And what I meant by an analog radicalization is that he sent away in the mail for a book called The Turner Diaries, which was enormously important to him. But it was cumbersome and difficult to get a hold of a book and distribute a book, and not that many people could do it. The difference today is so profound, whether you look at the Michigan plot, which was planned over private Facebook groups, or you look at the white supremacist violence that we have seen, whether it was January 6th or the shooting, the Walmart in El Paso, the synagogue in Pittsburgh, Dylan Roof in the church in South Carolina, the grocery store in Buffalo. The thing they all have in common is digital radicalization, the ability to both learn and share right wing propaganda is so much easier now that it's almost an entirely different animal because it's so easy to spread these ideas. And McVeigh said to his lawyers at one point, it's a quote that that I think is so revelatory, is that he said, "I knew there was an army out there, I just couldn't find them." And he was right, but premature.
Indeed. So let's talk a little bit about the Turner Diaries, which is a book that is all over your book, and it's a work that's arguably one of the most important pieces of American political thought. Um, Tell us a little bit about that book, and then why it resonated with Timothy McVeigh and others.
Well, the central interest of McVeigh's life, from his upbringing, where he grew up outside Buffalo, New York, and his father worked in a GM plant for 30 years. His grandfather worked in the same GM plant for 30 years. He didn't. That plant was shrinking almost to insignificance by the time McVeigh came along. It was not an option for him. But McVeigh was obsessed with guns. He just he wasn't really a hunter, but he just loved to shoot guns and possess guns and study about guns. And he joined the NRA in the 1980s, and in the back of NRA publications he saw these little ads for a novel called The Turner Diaries. The Turner Diaries was written by a neo-Nazi white supremacist named William Pierce. It's a really malignant, awful book, and the story of the Turner Diaries is the the federal government has been taken over by a sinister cabal of blacks and Jews, and the sin and the main thing the government does is they pass a law mandating the confiscation of all privately owned firearms. The law is known as the Cohen Act. It's very subtle. And Earl Turner um, decides to fight back. And the way he decides to fight back is he rents a truck, big truck, fills it with fertilizer and fuel oil, and he parks it in front of the FBI building in Washington, sets it off with a fuse, uh, and kills 700 people. That act inspires a broad rebellion against the evil federal government, which ultimately succeeds and restores a white supremacist federal government. McVeigh used the Turner Diaries in a very explicit way as his model. That's why he bombed the federal building in Oklahoma City, because like Earl Turner, he wanted to set off a rebellion against the federal government. And this book has been a touchstone of right wing extremists, including the January 6th people, for many years. It was originally published in 1978.
It is a really vile book, but it is also a really important book. And Amazon and a lot of other outlets no longer sell it. And I guess my question is, I mean, shouldn't more folks understand that book? Because clearly, lots of people are reading that book, and it's helpful to have some insights into those brains.
Jay, this is a great question, and it's one of the many issues on which beats the hell out of me. I don't. I mean, it's a problem because it is a radicalizing tool, and after January 6th, that's when the Amazon in particular stopped selling it. Um, and this issue has arisen particularly historically about the issue of Mein Kampf, Hitler's book, which, I mean, you can hardly disagree that it's a very important document, but it is also a radicalizing tool by some very bad people. And I think Amazon does not sell Mein Kampf either. I guess the answer is, the book has been out for so long, and it's available in so many ways. The fact that Amazon doesn't sell it doesn't fill me with sadness. But the idea of whether you should um, limit a bad book's availability or show people what it means, it's a hard question, and I don't have a solution to that.
Yeah, thank you. Um, so the politics of guns are all over the story of Timothy McVeigh's actions, and indeed the gun policies of the Clinton administration are a crucial step in this story. Um, but it's also the fact that that one of the legacies of this period is some dramatic movement in gun policy, especially at the state level. And one of the ironies that you point out is that in Oklahoma now, if someone like Timothy McVeigh was stopped and had a firearm, he would be free to go with a ticket, right? Rather than being locked up as he was, which was so crucial to catching him so quickly.
The I don't. It almost seems. I don't want to sound overly facile in this, in saying this, but it's not 100% wrong to say that McVeigh won. McVeigh won on gun policy. When you look at the difference, whether it's the Supreme Court saying for the first time in American history that the Second Amendment doesn't refer to state militias, but in fact gives people an individual right to bear arms, something the Supreme Court said for the first time in 2008 in the Heller case. Um, this is what McVeigh was fighting for. And if you look at um, particularly in the states, including, for example, Arkansas, the limits on gun ownership, whether it's private carry, you know, whether you need a permit or not. I mean, it's dramatically different from what it was in the 90s. And, I think many people remember, and I suspect many of you remember, that McVeigh set off the bomb on April 19th, 1995, because it was the second anniversary of the Waco raid, which was a disastrous event, 76 people killed outside Waco, Texas. But it's not just Waco. And there's another date that's just as important, which is September 14th, 1994, which was the date that President Clinton signed the assault weapons ban. And that was what prompted McVeigh to make the final decision with Terry Nichols to go ahead with the bombing. So it wasn't just Waco, it was the assault weapons ban. And if you see what McVeigh was writing at the times and what he said afterwards, that was um, just as important as Waco. And if I can just elaborate on that point for a second, the assault weapons ban had a 10-year window. And so it expired in 2004 when President George W. Bush was in office, and he wasn't going to sign an assault weapons ban, and it expired. When you look at the right-wing violence after 2004, they didn't have to go to all the trouble of buying fertilizer and renting trucks and finding fuel oil. They just go and buy an AR-15 and shoot up a school or shoot up a synagogue or shoot up a church. Is that the right-wing violence today is so much easier to do because guns, especially assault weapons, are so easily available today.
So we are at the Clinton Presidential Center, and we are here in Little Rock. And so let's talk about the Arkansan who was president at the time of this bombing. And one of the most fascinating chapters is one that's entitled "Fighting This All My Life." It's kind of right in the middle of the book. And it really focuses on Bill Clinton's Arkansas experience in shaping how he thought about this case, and indeed how he thought about this case immediately in a way that was counter to what he was being told by some in his administration.
This to me was so interesting and surprising. Okay, so this is, let me give you a little bit of the chronology of how this unfolded in my reporting. So, when you're going to interview a big deal person, like, for example, a former president of the United States, you want to have as much background information as possible. So I interviewed a number of, White House aides from that period. And if you may recall, when the bomb happened in 1995, a lot of people, especially on the news, said this was Middle Eastern terrorism. And it wasn't a crazy hypothesis. It had been only 2 years since the first World Trade Center bombing, which was a truck bomb, actually a Ryder truck bomb, just like this. There was a lot of speculation to that effect. President Clinton, on the day of the bombing, gave a statement in the White House press room, and he said all the appropriate things. He expressed sympathy. He said there was going to be a thorough investigation, but of course he didn't speculate publicly about who did it, because that would have been entirely inappropriate. However, what his aides told me was, back in the Oval Office, as they were, chatting about what was going on, someone said, people said to him, a lot of people think this is Middle Eastern, and Clinton said, no, this was the militias. I know it. How did he know? And so that was practically the first question I asked him when I had the opportunity. And we didn't plan this. Jay, can I have my book for a second?
Oh, sure.
Anyway, I just thought, since you're an Arkansas audience, I should read you what he said. I remember that I looked up the page. This was domestic, homegrown, the militias, he said to his staff. I know these people. As Clinton recalled many years later, that is with me, I said, you guys have got to understand, I told them, I've been fighting this all my life. Clinton's view emerged from long familiarity with right-wing extremism. Throughout his 12 years as governor of Arkansas, Clinton had seen the movement up close. His state had long been the home for some of the worst of these zealots, and Clinton dealt frequently with the fallout from their rage. Clinton's long political career in the state, combined with his extroverted nature, he's extroverted, you know that? Made it seem like he knew everyone in Arkansas. As a result, right-wing terror often had a personal dimension for him. McVeigh had closely followed the story of Gordon Kahl, the notorious tax protester who came to a violent end on Clinton's watch. After Kahl killed 2 federal marshals in North Dakota, he fled south to the small northwest Arkansas town of Smithville in Lawrence County. Acting on a tip on June 3, 1983, federal, state, and local law enforcement confronted Kahl at the home where he was hiding out. In the ensuing battle, both Kahl and the local sheriff were killed. As Clinton recalled, Kahl murdered a sheriff in Lawrence County who was my campaign coordinator, Gene Matthews. Then there was Richard Snell. Anyway, I don't want to read this whole thing, but Richard Snell shot and killed a black Arkansas state trooper named Lewis Bryant. As Clinton remembered in 2022, he was a black state trooper whose brother-in-law, Ralph, was on my security detail in Arkansas as governor. So, I mean, this is Bill Clinton, right? I mean, he knows everyone in the state, including, you know, and you know, he also talked about right after he became governor in his first term, the KKK, which at the time was headquartered in Harrison, Arkansas, its national headquarters up in the north of the state, planned a march here in Little Rock, and Clinton arranged for a major police presence, but allowed the march to go forward, which turned out to be, just a handful of misfits. But he managed to thread the needle of protecting the First Amendment and protecting the community. But anyway, I was so fascinated by the fact that Clinton was so prescient about who did this, and also what his influences were.
And indeed, McVeigh got his Ku Klux Klan membership card from that Harrison.
From Harrison, yes.
Headquarters. And Arkansas is peppered throughout this book in a number of key spots, but obviously the president, the most central one. I think those around the Clinton presidency almost all say Oklahoma City was this really crucial moment in the Clinton presidency. It was a tumultuous time. It was just a few months after the 1994 elections. It had been a challenging few weeks, I think, before this, the bombing. And by that weekend, he had delivered arguably the best speech of his presidency. And he had really begun to reshape his presidency, and especially against those who were so critical of government, the federal government in particular. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Right. Well, just to reorient you, Clinton's elected in 1992. In 1994, the midterms, there's a big Republican landslide, and the Republicans take control of the House of Representatives for the first time since the 1950s, and Newt Gingrich becomes the Speaker of the House. And Gingrich really dominates American politics for several months, and acts and describes himself almost as like the prime minister. And Clinton is just sort of like, oh, well, you can do foreign policy, but I'm like in charge of the country. And on April 18th, the night before, Clinton holds a press conference where he is forced to say, and it still galls him that he thinks people misinterpreted what he said, but I think what he said is what he said. He said, well, I'm the president and the Constitution makes me relevant. I mean, it's like he had to argue for his own relevance the day before the bombing. But two things happened. One is on that Sunday, the bombing is on a Monday, but on the Saturday, he comes to Oklahoma and gives a very, I'm sorry, this is almost like a cliche of Bill Clinton, but he feels their pain. And he does. I mean, this is why this guy was such a successful politician, is he had this wonderful knowledge of how people felt. And he captured both the horror, but the hope and the love that was in, for the people who were lost. And that's one, and that speech is the one that's remembered. But there were other speeches that were even more, I don't know about even, I don't want to edit myself here, equally significant. He gives a series of speeches where he basically says, look, you want to hate government, this is what you get. And it was, gave a speech about the militias in particular, and he went to Michigan to do it because the militias there were so active. And he says, you can't love your country and hate your government. And again, it's one of his most famous utterances as president. But then he goes to Minnesota and gives a speech where he talks about talk radio. And he says, and this was the heyday of Rush Limbaugh. This was when Newt Gingrich was ratcheting up political rhetoric to a level that really hadn't been seen in many years, talking about he was the only person keeping us from Auschwitz in the United States. Rush Limbaugh saying, we are this close. I am holding my fingers about a quarter inch apart from a second American Revolution. And Clinton calls him out on that and says, yes, you have freedom of speech, but you should know the consequences of your speech. What Clinton didn't know, and frankly, what no one knew until I got into those archives in Texas, was that as McVeigh was driving around the country from upstate New York to Oklahoma City to Michigan to Arizona to Arkansas, he was listening to Rush Limbaugh 3 hours a day. I mean, he was a ditto head. And, it's important to say that most people, the vast, vast majority of people who listen to Rush Limbaugh didn't bomb any buildings and didn't commit any crimes at all. But nor is it a coincidence that McVeigh was inspired by Limbaugh in a way that Clinton could see and called out. And just, I'm sorry to just go on about this a little bit more. Gordon Liddy was also another talk show host who was very, inciting during this period. And when Clinton gave that speech, Limbaugh and Liddy were appalled and aggrieved. It's like, no, we never told anyone to commit any crimes. We never said go out and bomb a building. We never said commit acts of violence. It's exactly the same thing, the same defense that Donald Trump said after January 6th. I never exactly said go into the Capitol and try to kill Nancy Pelosi. I never said violate the law, but you didn't have to be Sherlock Holmes to figure out what was really going on.
Yeah, and he gave that speech in Oklahoma City, but he also just kept going back. He stayed connected with Oklahoma, I think, in some important ways. And the governor of Oklahoma at the time, Frank Keating, is somebody he had known at Georgetown, and they kind of
as undergraduates
reconnected in a way. And the folks I've gotten to be, as when we were walking in, I've gotten to be friends with the folks at the Oklahoma City Memorial and Museum, which is a great facility, and they are so conscious of the care that the president continued to give in a state that was not one where he was ever going to have political success.
Well, the issue of hatred of federal power is such a deep and resonant one in American history. Everyone, of course, should read Homegrown, but there's another book you might want to read, which is a book that a historian named Jefferson Cowie wrote last year, won the Pulitzer Prize, called Freedom's Dominion. And it's about a county in Alabama where it happens to be the home county of George Wallace, but he traces through going back all the way to the Civil War, how anger at the federal government has been a touchstone of right-wing violence and right-wing anger in this country almost since the inception. And but only some federal governments. And one of the things that I always take exception to is one of the shorthands that is sometimes used to describe McVeigh is anti-government. They say he was anti-government. He wasn't anti-government. He was anti the federal government of Bill Clinton. And that's an important distinction. And there are certain acts of the federal government. Obviously, I don't have to. Little Rock Central High School. I don't have to tell you about the federal government here under President Eisenhower, the anger and integrating your great high school, and that anger at the federal government for doing certain things, often with regard to race, is something that connects right-wing violence throughout almost the entirety of American history.
Indeed. So much of the second half of this book is really about the legal proceedings that played out and culminated with, of course, the death sentence for McVeigh and a life sentence without parole for Terry Nichols. And the differences between the prosecutorial team and the defense teams are really fascinating ones, both in terms of personalities, but also in terms of strategies. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about this. And obviously, this is the turf where you covered the story in that period, was really around these dynamics.
Well, I covered the story, but all I saw at the time was what was public. What I didn't know and what I didn't see until I got into those documents was what was going on behind the scenes, which was so fascinating. On the day that Stephen Jones began representing McVeigh told him, "I did this and I'm proud of it." Makes defense a little difficult, so I mean, I don't begrudge defense lawyers from representing guilty clients. I mean, that's what they do, and then that's what they should do. But it was certainly challenging. What was bizarre about Jones's defense is that McVeigh told him from day one, "I did this by myself, and I did this, with some help from Terry Nichols, but there was no broader conspiracy." And Jones never really believed him, and to this day doesn't believe him. I believe McVeigh. I have studied this case. I don't think there was a broader conspiracy. And what's interesting about the issue of the broader conspiracy is that both the left and the right in this country have an interest in saying there was a broader conspiracy. For example, the left would love to have you know that this was a broad right-wing conspiracy, that lots of right-wingers wanted to blow up the Murrah Building and kill all those people. And McVeigh had some contact with some other right-wingers, particularly a weird sort of commune called Elohim City, which is actually very near the Arkansas border in Oklahoma. But he never he never recruited anyone to the conspiracy, but that's what the left wants. What the right wants is to establish that this was really a foreign conspiracy, that amazingly enough, there's an eccentric congressman no longer in the House named Dana Rohrabacher who did a whole investigation in the early 2000s aimed at trying to prove that Osama bin Laden had some connection to Timothy McVeigh. Ridiculous, absurd. But there has been a long effort on the part of some on the right to define terrorism exclusively as something that comes from overseas, especially the Muslim world. That terrorism is Muslim. And that is a way of distancing the right from what's really gone on. And this is why every time There's something like January 6th. You hear people on Fox News saying, well, this was probably agents provocateurs from Antifa, that they really wanted to discredit the right by, saying that the right did this. President Trump said that. It's nonsense. I mean, so the left wants to make a big right wing conspiracy, and the right wants to make it look like every terrorist is an Islamic extremist.
And at the time when you were reporting on this case, you were very much focused on the courtroom, right? And you weren't as focused on some of these broader kind of political dimensions. And I think you kind of say, I give myself a break for doing that, but that you realize now you missed some of the story.
I certainly did. And but again, one of the things about writing relatively recent history like the 90s is you kind of forget like what was going on simultaneously. For example, the bombing was, as we know, April 1995. In January 1995, the O.J. Simpson criminal case started. I think you remember that. And it was this crazy national spectacle. People sometimes remember, where were you when the Oklahoma City bombing happened? I know where I was. I was in Judge Ito's courtroom. And the person who was put in charge of the investigation was a young Justice Department official named Merrick Garland. And Merrick Garland, now the Attorney General, was appalled at what was going on in the O.J. Simpson case and didn't want the prosecution of McVeigh and Nichols to resemble that case at all. So what he decided is he wanted to keep the case as narrow as possible, focusing exclusively on, did McVeigh set off this bomb, and not particularly on why he set off this bomb. There was some background in the case to show motive, but the case was very narrowly focused on the mechanics of whodunit. It's hard to disagree with that approach, and it certainly worked. In the McVeigh case, he was sentenced to death and he was executed in 2001. But I think that focus, which was different from President Clinton's focus, gave a somewhat misleading impression that McVeigh was a pure lone wolf, that this was not part of a broader political movement. And that, to me, was something I missed in covering the story in the mid-90s, and is something, one reason I wrote Homegrown was to try to rectify that impression.
Let's talk a little bit about the prosecutorial team. Obviously, Stephen Jones was the bigger personalities were on the defense side, but let's talk a little bit about the prosecutorial team, and not just what their strategy was, but kind of how they carried out the prosecution of McVeigh and Nichols.
Right. I mean, the Justice Department, Janet Reno was the Attorney General. She sort of turned this over to Jamie Gorelick, who was the Deputy Attorney General, and Merrick Garland was the top aide to Jamie Gorelick. And as I said, they wanted to make this the anti-OJ case. The lead prosecutor was, and in part because they wanted to sort of, I mean, obviously this is a tremendously emotional subject, but they wanted to try to dial that back as much as possible. They brought in a prosecution team from Washington, not the Oklahoma City U.S. Attorney's Office, which created some friction between them. But Joe Hartzler was the lead prosecutor. He had been a prosecutor in Chicago, later in Central Illinois, and the goal was to keep it as low key as possible. Just the facts. Hartzler had a sign that he put on his door called "Don't bury the crime in clutter," which meant don't call any more witnesses than you have to. Prove that McVeigh did it and get the heck out of there. There were literally thousands of interviews done in the course of this investigation involving hundreds of law enforcement officials. The prosecution put on its case against McVeigh in 18 trial days. It's not a lot. It's not a lot. And again, it was an attempt not to be the O.J. Simpson case, which took months and months and allowed the defense to sow doubts as it stretched on and on.
So are you, since obviously we got a lot of other prosecutions going on now for January 6th and events around that, are you sensing at all that the government prosecutors who are working on those cases are taking any any clues from this strategy? I mean,
Well, I think very, Merrick Garland is the same person.
yep.
And he is someone who has a visceral disdain for the theatrics and the public role of prosecutors. And I think, frankly, it's somewhat unfortunate. I think Garland has shown a lot of courage in supervising the investigation, especially, I think people forget about this now. In many respects, the most amazing, the most courageous thing he did was okaying the search of Mar-a-Lago. I mean, suppose they'd found nothing. Imagine if they had searched the former president's home and found nothing. I mean, that took a lot of courage. Now it turns out they found in, Mar-a-Lago's famous bathroom all this, classified information. But so in terms of the substance, I think Garland deserves a lot of credit. And of course, they've prosecuted 1,000 people for the Capitol riot, and now they've brought these two very serious cases against former President Clinton. However, what Garland has not done, and here I think he can be faulted somewhat, is he has not talked publicly. He has not used the bully pulpit that is available to him to talk about the threat of right-wing violence. Chris Wray, the FBI director, has done more and said the greatest threat to public life in terms of terrorism is not Islam, is not the left, but is right-wing terrorism. And if you look at the statistics over the last decade or so, about 75% of the political violence in this country does come from the right. But I think Garland is manifesting this hostility to public performance that I think has limited his influence and effectiveness in talking about what's really going on out there.
Yeah. So the close of this book, of course, really thinks about the legacies of Timothy McVeigh, and I'd love you to talk a little bit about why he still matters in terms. And you've hinted at this, of course, early on, but maybe get a little more specific in thinking about the ways in which we still see Timothy McVeigh in our lives.
When you look at the January 6th rioters and those who inspired them, the Proud Boys and the groups, there are three motivations that are really central. One is the belief that you have to fight to protect your right to bear arms. Guns was central to why they were out there in front of and inside the Capitol, because they were afraid that Nancy Pelosi was going to and President Joe Biden were going to pass laws to take away their guns. So guns are central. Second, the American Revolution. This was a surprise to me. I was not aware of this. If you look at what how the January 6th rioters were talking about what they were going to do in the period leading up, they were over and over analogizing their work to the colonists who fought the British. Congresswoman Boebert of Colorado, on the eve of January 6th, said, "Today is 1776." The prologue to my book is called 1776, where you see the citations to the Declaration of Independence, not the famous part, not we hold these truths to be self-evident, but the later parts of the Declaration of Independence where Jefferson is explaining why they have to take up arms against the British. This obsession with and the analogy to the American Revolution is central to understanding what was going on. And the third point is the belief that your cause is so just that you're entitled to use violence. I mean, that's why they broke into the Capitol. It was a violent act. So guns, the American Revolution, violence, all three of those were central to McVeigh's motives to bomb the Murrah Building. Those three motives carried forward. And if you look at all the right-wing violence since 1995, and I have a long epilogue in the book cataloging it. And frankly, I was not aware of how much there has been since 1995. It's a lot. And those motivations, guns, the American Revolution, violence, carry forward, and they ain't going anywhere either. I mean, just to, what happened after, Timothy McVeigh was executed 3 months to the day before 9/11. 9/11 convinced a lot of Americans that all terrorism was foreign based, or at least Islamic based. And some on the right took advantage of that to try to push people in that direction. But right-wing violence never went away in this country. And that's what I learned in writing the book. And, I think an important message for people to remember.
Yeah. So we got a number of questions from folks in the audience who emailed in advance, and a lot of them really did focus on where things are headed and where, as we look to 2024, as we look ahead, what are you sensing about right-wing extremism in that context? And of course, how it is shaped by the outcome of the election, whichever way it goes.
Well, I think, again, I think the Justice Department deserves a lot of credit for how aggressive they have been. And, I think there is, one, as in the old Sherlock Holmes story, the dog that didn't bark, every time President Trump has been arraigned, and unlike most former presidents, Trump gets arraigned a lot. And each time he gets arraigned, there are barricades up and there are worries about violence. The Justice Department has said to people, you want to engage in violence like this, your ass is going to be arrested. And there has been, I think, a considerable deterrent effect there. Similarly, the main Washington case in federal court, I think is going to give some people pause about challenging the results of the next election in a way that is outside the law. I just wrote something recently about Ken Chesborough, who was one of the defendants in the Atlanta case, who was my law school classmate and someone I knew pretty well. And it was like, if you want to be a lawyer, be a lawyer. There are provisions for challenging close elections. Al Gore demanded recounts in Florida, got recounts in Florida, litigated the recounts in Florida. And, I think that's as American as apple pie. Creating fake electors who have certificates purporting to be electors and going to, Vice President Pence and saying, oh, well, pick these electors. That's like when you get stopped by a cop driving, and you say, well, I drew up my own driver's license. How's this? And then that's not how it works. And I think there is going to be a significant deterrent effect to the results of other elections. Um, again, depending on who wins. If Donald Trump wins the next election in January 24, in November of 2024, I suspect he will think this is a clean as a whistle, this election. But if he loses, I think he is going to have somewhat more trouble challenging the outcome through extrajudicial means because of the efforts of of the Justice Department.
Obviously, we've seen a lot of the leadership of the Proud Boys kind of taken away by these cases. We've seen in the Whitmer case, some of the leadership, key players in the Michigan militia. I mean, organizationally, where are those kind of right-wing extremist organizations at this point after these cases?
Well, if you look at the history, as I do in the end of the book, you see that this goes in waves, as does the attention of federal law enforcement. After Oklahoma City in 1995, the FBI stopped a lot of plots because they devoted a lot of energy and intelligence to stopping plots. After 9/11, the FBI took its eye off the ball. And I think one of the lesser known stories about January 6th is that the FBI didn't listen to what it was hearing and didn't prepare adequately for what was going on. I think the FBI, and I give Ray credit for this, is energized on this subject at the moment. But the history is that this attention diminishes over time. As I mentioned with the Jeff Cowie book, right-wing violence in this country never goes away, and it's not going to go away, and it requires the kind of vigilance that has not always been present.
Yeah. One last question that we got from an audience member really was a question about the globalization of this movement, that American right-wing extremism is the degree to which it's beginning to pop its head into other democracies around the globe. Thoughts on that piece?
Well, again, I think this is an illustration of the way the internet has shrunk the world. That Viktor Orban, who is the prime minister of Hungary, is a great favorite of Tucker Carlson, who is still an important voice on the right. In the 1990s, I am quite sure that the prime minister of Hungary was not someone who was even known to most of these people. I mean, that kind of international contact was just so much more difficult than it is today. And again, I want to be very careful, not to associate, all people on the right with right-wing violence. I mean, we're talking about a subset, but you can't understand Donald Trump without understanding Brexit. The vote in Brexit was, leading up to in 2016 President Trump's victory there, and the fixation and anger against immigration in particular is something that ties all these right-wing movements together, and it was something that McVeigh was concerned about as well. So yes, there is this considerable international dimension, but the right wing in the United States does fine even without international attention.
Great. Jeff Toobin, thank you so much for writing this book. Thank you so much for coming to the Clinton Presidential Center, and thanks for a great conversation.
Well, thank you, Jay. Thank you all for coming.
Let me also offer my thanks, Jay, to both you and Jeff for a really fascinating and very timely conversation this evening on a critically important topic at this point in our history. I'm Stephanie Street, Executive Director of the Clinton Foundation, and on behalf of all of my colleagues and our wonderful volunteers here at the Clinton Presidential Center, I want to say thank you for joining us, and a very special thank you to our Clinton Center members and donors for their generous support. And I really appreciate you mentioning our friends in the Oklahoma City Museum. Many of you may remember in 2010, we had a special exhibition honoring the folks in Oklahoma City and remembering that horrific day. And it's hard to believe that we're going to be approaching the 30th anniversary in 2025. And so I'm sure with our friends at Oklahoma City, we'll be doing something special to commemorate that very, very terrible day in our history. I want to also encourage you all to stay around if you'd like to purchase a book, or if you already have. Jeff is going to be signing copies of his book,
or buy two.
Or buy 2 or 3 or 5. Yes, he'll be signing those. You can purchase those from the Clinton Museum store. And if you would all stay seated for a moment while I ask Jay and Jeff to exit the stage and go set up for the book signing. Thank you all again, and thank you, Jeff, for making your way back to Little Rock.